This is episode 77 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week, we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. This week, I am pleased to be joined by Dean Stansel. He is a professor at Southern Methodist University, and he is the author of a very interesting new report. And we've had him on the show to talk about other reports relating to economic freedom, which we'll briefly discuss. But Dean, welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and the latest report is available at the Reason Foundation website, reason.org. We can put a link up on the show notes page, but the report is ranking U.S. metropolitan areas on the Economic Freedom Index. And you're kind of the go-to guy here, both at the state level and at now the municipal level with regard to economic freedom. So talk a little bit about kind of how you got into this report and this issue and what this new report tries to do.
Oh, sure thing. So it was about probably 30 years ago when Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and a bunch of economists and think tank people got together and said, wouldn't it be nice if we had a sort of numeric measure of how free different societies were or are, I should say. And so it took them about 5 years, but they finally came up with something that is now known as the Economic Freedom of the World Index or report that the Fraser Institute, a think tank in Canada, in collaboration with think tanks all over the world, like Cato here in the U.S., they publish that every year. So it's every year you get an updated rank of country level levels of economic freedom. And so it took them a couple years after they did the country one. They said, wait a minute, we could do this at the state level. So in Canada, they call them provinces. So they, about 5 years later, came up with a state level one, which is now what they call the Economic Freedom of North America report. And I got involved with that about, I guess it's 6 years ago now, as the primary author on that report that comes out every year. But before I had gotten involved with them, and part of what led me to getting involved probably is that because a lot of my early research as a grad student and as a young professor involved local level data, I took a look at what they were doing at the state level, and I said, I could just drill down to the metro area level and do a local version of this. No one has ever done it. It'd be something brand new. And so I actually did one of these that came out just as an academic journal article in 2013, so about 6 years ago. And it only had 1 year of data, so it wasn't terribly useful to anyone. And it was a good bit out of date because the data's really lagged on this stuff. But anyways, I eventually got around to what came out just earlier this year. This updated version where it's got 9 years of data across 5 decades. So I expanded it backwards, I updated it forwards. And the Reason Foundation published this one called the U.S. Metro Area Economic Freedom Index, and that is how I got involved with this ongoing project of measuring economic freedom at the state and local level. And I look forward to updating this in the future. It generates a lot of interest. I always like to know where their local area ranks on these things.
Yeah, and before we get into some of the details about economic freedom itself and how you measure it and how that all contrasts and compares with your state index, you do metropolitan area, and I think that is a critical point because you're not just talking about cities proper, you're talking about the whole region, and kind of discuss that briefly because just in many states, especially back east, you've got cities with a lot of suburban communities that don't necessarily embrace all the economically idiotic proposals and ideas that the major metro tends to do. So how did you kind of work through that problem associated with this report?
Yeah, so I would much prefer to have done a municipality-based index where you've got the cities and the suburbs ranked separately. Unfortunately, the primary data source for the tax and spending stuff that's the bulk of the index, about 2/3 of the index, is not conducive to that. And also, if you think about over time, and this is true, especially in the Sun Belt, you think about a city like Phoenix, right? What we think of as the city of Phoenix changes over time as they expand aggressively, pulling in what used to be suburban areas. So it gets real hard with areas like Phoenix. Houston's done a lot of that annexation as well. That Dallas, where I live, hasn't really done much. They're kind of hemmed in by their suburbs, but it's just a data problem. You can't get comparable data over time for the city because the city changes. And then the other part of it is, even if the city boundaries weren't changing, there are a variety of local, kind of regional, single-purpose governments, metropolitan transit districts, things like that. And the way that the Census Bureau reports the data for those that tend to the big part here is it tends to overlap, not be contiguous with city boundaries. So it's providing services, in the case of, say, a metropolitan transit district, for suburban residents as well as city residents. But when they report the data, they throw spending in at the central, wherever the central city is. So in a sense, it's biased against the big central city, because that they're showing all the spending there, and it's not clear how you could get around that. Anyhow, so that's why we went with metro areas. It's about as far as you can drill down and still be comparable over time and across areas that do things differently. And it's not, like any of these things, like when we talk about the state one, there are flaws. There are things that are not ideal, but it's a work in progress, and you kind of do the best you can. It provides us some insight into how economic freedom not only varies across states, as we can tell with the state index, but varies within states as well. You can get a fair amount of variation across areas there, and it helps us to kind of then use that as a way to compare and contrast population growth, that sort of thing.
Got it. Yeah, and thanks for that. It's it's always good to go into the data itself and how it's collected and where it's all available before you go into some of the concepts and the results. And I've learned that in my time in public policy, because you often see these studies done. No matter what side folks are on, they tend to use the data that works best for their own messaging and whatever they're trying to do. And, not that metropolitan areas wouldn't necessarily be a good way to use the data, but it is critical to point out that it's metro areas, not just cities proper. And again, that's a big deal coming from the East Coast. Not as big of a deal out west, where cities had a little more room to run and grow. But let's talk about the meat of the issue at hand here, which is, of course, economic freedom. Now, I'd like you to define economic freedom as you see it, but more importantly, since we've talked to you in the past about statewide economic freedom, can you briefly explain how your measurements of economic freedom are affected by going kind of down a level of government to the metro area? How do you see metro economic freedom differently, if at all, from at the state level?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So the kind of the textbook definition of economic freedom that they came up with 30 years ago, as I was talking about with Friedman and those people, they define it, they say individuals have economic freedom when property they acquire without the use of force, fraud, or theft is protected from physical invasions by others, and they are free to use, exchange, or give their property as long as their actions do not violate the identical rights of others. It's kind of the libertarian notion of we ought to be free to use our stuff, our resources, our time, and our money however we want, as long as we're not harming anyone else. So what we're attempting to do with an economic freedom index is measure, well, how free are we, right, in the economic sphere on that thing? How free are we to use our resources as we see fit? So what I've done here is simply mimicked what is done at the state level with the Economic Freedom of North America, and just drilled it down to the local level. So it's the identical methodology with one exception, and I'll explain that along the way. But the way it's done then is we have three broad areas of economic policy. One measures government spending, right? So the more government spends, the more money it kind of takes out of the private economy, and the more it competes with the private economy in terms of the provision of some of the goods and services they do provide. So we've got three different slices of government spending, and all of these measures, in order to compare across areas with different standards of living, we divide by income. So we take basically the total dollars spent and divide by personal income, so that we're getting a true measure of the burden on someone who lives there in that area with the income levels that exist there. Because otherwise, I see these things measured per capita periodically, and it doesn't make as much sense because, for instance, say a tax burden of $5,000 per capita. Well, in Mississippi, a low-income state like Mississippi, that's going to be really burdensome compared to in a state like New York, with probably twice as much per capita income. It's not going to be as burdensome. So you really got to divide by income, and that's to make it comparable across areas. So we do that in Area 1 with government spending. Area 2 is taxes. As we look at three different components of tax revenue, we do not have the ability, unlike in the state report, to have top income tax rate. And it's just a data collection problem. There are I can't remember. I don't think New Mexico has any of these, but there are states that have that have local income taxes. I believe it was Kentucky where I finally threw up my hands and gave up, where each school district has or maybe it was each county, but whatever it was going to be like 100 different places. And I was on the phone with someone at the state revenue office saying, I'm just trying to get the data on what your local income tax rates are going back 5 decades, right? Minor request, right? But they couldn't even give me the current year. They're like, well, you're just going to have to call each and every county and ask them. And so I gave up. It's an important variable to have in there, but it just would have taken an army of research assistants burning up phone lines to figure it out. So that's not in there. But of course, we have income tax revenue as well as the other forms of revenue. So we take Area 2. Area 3 is a measure of labor market freedom. So this one's a little more complicated. We have the first one is the minimum wage annual income. So in other words, take whatever the minimum wage is in that area and multiply it by 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year to get an annual value, and then you just divide that by per capita income in that area, again, to make it comparable across areas with different standards of living. And what that does is it gives us a way to determine, to measure how much the minimum wage is actually kind of binding in the labor market. Because, for example, you take the federal minimum wage that most places use, at least about half of the states, I believe, use the federal level. Well, in a state like New York with high income, it's not going to be nearly as binding as in a state like Mississippi with low income. And so this variable enables us to capture that in a way that makes it comparable across areas with different income levels. The second degree to which the public sector competes with the private sector in labor markets. So we take government employment and divide that by total employment. And the third thing is to, rather than a binary variable, 0 or 1 for whether it's a right to work state, we look at private union density. In other words, the percentage of employees that are members of unions. This allows us to get a kind of a more robust measure of how union rules can be impactful in the labor market. And so those are the 9 variables, 3 across these 3 areas, and in each of those areas we give them a 0 to 10. We give each variable a 0 to 10 score, where 10 is most free, 0 is least free, and everyone's going to score proportionally in between. And then we just average them to get 3 area scores. So this is Area 1 score for spending, Area 2 for taxes, Area 3 for labor market. Those 3 to get your overall score. And one thing I left out that I should point out is that on all of these, states vary in how centralized their kind of state and local governing structure is. We have to add in a measure for state level burden as well. So for on tax burden, we'll take the total state tax revenue and divide it by state income and use that ratio to add on top of the local ratio. And so it is truly a not just local, but it captures the cost in economic freedom terms to living in that area, both statewide and local-wise.
All right. Well, it sounds to me like, in general, your measurements, the tools, more closely resemble the state measurements in your Fraser Institute report than the Fraser Institute state index resembles federal governments. You get less and less policy levers, fewer policy levers as you go down. A nation, for example, has its own currency and can manage that, and central banking, all that stuff fades away, at least at American, at state level. And then at the city level, one of the things, or municipal level, you're talking no right to work, or that's really not controlled. Although, interestingly enough, just recently in New Mexico, our legislature successfully banned local governments from adopting right to work ordinance at the local government level. So we had been working successfully with local governments adopting right to work, but thanks to decisions out of Santa Fe, that has come to an end, unfortunately.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's a problem.
Well, that's one of many problems in New Mexico, and I guess that's a good segue to the rankings themselves. And one of the things you talk about is the area of government and how it impacts local governments. They compete for labor, and one of the surprising things to me, and you can find your main report has 52 metropolitan areas, but if you go to the Excel spreadsheet, you've got 382 metro areas, and that includes Farmington, New Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Albuquerque, and Las Cruces. So you do have 4 metro areas from the state of New Mexico included. And I think the average New Mexico listener would be downright shocked by the fact that Santa Fe comes in as the most economically free metropolitan area, and the most conservative by all accounts. Farmington comes in at the least economically free, not just least economically free in New Mexico, but it's down there overall. And generally, New Mexico's municipals perform or metros. I keep on inserting these different words, but the gist of it is that the 4 areas measured, New Mexico's metro areas perform quite poorly overall in the report. So, looking at that kind of situation, knowing that Santa Fe has one of the highest city level municipal minimum wages in the entire country, how is this all working out in terms of New Mexico and maybe across the country? Because I see some other interesting dynamics, say with the Inland Empire in California and some of the coastal places, which we call San Francisco flat out socialist or communist in some respects, and yet they're seen as economically a little more free than a lot of those inland areas in California. So why don't you talk about some of those wrinkles that people might question?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So, and I'm glad you pointed that out. I forgot to mention that we have they're all scored together, but for the purposes of ranking, we did pull out the 52 largest, the ones with populations over 1 million. And rank those separately. Excuse me. Primarily just because those are the recognizable names for most people. But there are a total of 382 across the country that are considered to be metropolitan areas. And so, as you said, there's 4 of those in New Mexico. And another thing point is that we do grade on a curve explicitly. So. Just because you're the best in your state doesn't mean you're all that great. But another thing that goes on here, and the example you cited about the Inland Empire is a good one, is that we're looking at all of these things as 6 of the 9 variables, 7 really, are percentage of. And so if you are in an area with particularly low per capita income, then even if you have substantially lower spending levels and lower tax levels, that ratio isn't necessarily going to reflect it. And I'm looking at Table A10, which your listeners can get all this if they really wanted it at the Reason website. But there's a Table A10 that shows, it breaks it down by state, so you can conveniently see all 4 of those next to each other. And I see that on Farmington has a score of 3.05 out of 10, and they've sixes on the other two areas. So there's something going on there with spending being out of whack in that area compared to other areas that's pulling them down. And I think the higher income levels in Santa Fe and Albuquerque are probably pulling them up a little bit, right? Because they could have particularly high tax revenues, but they also have particularly high incomes relative to the other places, perhaps. Assuming that's the case income-wise, but maybe you could confirm that. Santa Fe and Albuquerque are richer than the other two, right?
Yeah. And Santa Fe, and I think this is the delicate issue you're dealing with. And I know, I'm sure you love having people kind of pick through your data and your research and kind of point out challenges and issues. But I think we could all agree that despite the policies, whether it's Santa Fe or San Francisco or Los Angeles, the overall economic sector has a lot to be said for it in terms of innovation and economic success in the private sector. Now, that doesn't mean that the political culture of San Francisco or Santa Fe is not inherently very left-wing, and the policies at least the city level don't reflect that. But I mean, I think it's a challenge. It's something that as a researcher, you're doing the best you can to overcome, but it's it is a unique issue that I think just makes it a challenge to really do this kind of work.
That's right. And in Los Angeles, they rank in the bottom 10 of those largest ones. They're 10th actually, from the 10th from the bottom. But note that they have, Orange County is considered part of that metro area. So you've got just like Washington D.C., right? They are ranked pretty high, but you've got the Virginia suburbs that have particularly low taxes and low high economic freedom in general. That are so in a lot of these cases, because we're limited to the metro area, you are getting what some would regard as kind of strange results with areas like Austin, Texas. No one in Texas would say that Austin is particularly free. That's because we're living in our bubble and comparing it
Interest rate.
out of these big metro areas, and so the suburbs of Austin surely are more free than the city itself, and you have a lot. That's all in the mix, cooked into the score. The suburban scores pulling up the inner city scores.
Right, and there's a great map, by the way, for listeners that you can go to the Reason website and find this index, and you can look at the economic freedom. And when you look at that, you really see, and this is the next point I wanted to bring up, how metro areas are in so many ways dictated by state level economic freedom. So in terms of measuring, though, metro areas often do transcend state lines. So if you could discuss that a little bit, because you've got Kansas City, I know, being from Cincinnati, Ohio, you've got a metro area that goes into 3 different states. Not such a big deal here in New Mexico, and quite frankly, one of the issues in Farmington might be the Navajo Reservation, which gets into San Juan County and might make those numbers more toward big government than even they really are. But talk about state level policies and how they really dictate things at the metro area, and then how communities are impacted by transcending state lines.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I did on this new and improved version that came out this year is I adjusted for that by doing essentially a population-weighted state-level figure. So in other words, as I said, on most of these variables, there's a state percentage of income, state revenue as a percentage of income that I add on to the local figure. And on those that cross boundaries, I just took the population percentage for the 2 or in some cases 3 states, and you weight the state portion so that you're able to see more accurately what the overall picture is. But again, here's the case, Paul, where ideally we could take the what is it, Louisville or no? Yeah, I think isn't Louisville on the border with Indiana and Kentucky? You could take the Indiana portion and the Kentucky portion and measure them separately. But because of the way the data is collected at the Census Bureau, you really can't do it, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you also look at the report and you see Texas and Florida, and overwhelmingly those places are incredibly economically free at the municipal level. Are there any other places that you saw that really stood out at you in terms of their results, either positively or negatively?
Sure. Yeah, Virginia is also full of high-level economic freedom metro areas. New York and California. One of the consistent stories we've seen at the state level is that if you just look at the four most populous four states with the highest population, you've got a real contrast with New York and California being ranked literally at or at least near the bottom in economic freedom, and Florida and Texas being ranked at or near the top. And you see that same picture here as well. As a matter of fact, so one of the variation within states, and you have in California, San Jose, the San Jose metro area is their most free metro area in the state of California, and we've got four different colors on the map. Blue is most free, and then green is second. So there's one little green spot in California, and that's the San Jose area, but even the most free area in California is substantially less free than the least free area in Florida. Now in Florida, but nevertheless, one of those is the lowest. I believe it was Panama City, if I remember, up in the Panhandle. But yeah. So even in your least free area in Florida, you're substantially freer than your most free in California.
No doubt about it. And I'm looking at El Paso, of course, and that's in the second quartile, which is relatively unfree by Texas standards, but knocks the socks off any area in New Mexico. And just looking at the map, you look at Farmington, Albuquerque, and Las Cruces are all in the red. Santa Fe is orange, which is the third quartile, red being the bottom quartile. But, it's pretty interesting. You do see the patterns at the state level, but considering Colorado, Utah, and even Arizona, they're very diverse in the sense that they have multiple different colors within their state boundaries. It's a little bit unique in some of our neighboring states how diverse the metro area governments are in terms of economic freedom. Nevada's another one. You think of Nevada as being just this bastion of freedom. They've got second and third quartiles, but they're not knocking it out of the park like Texas or Florida.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. There's room for improvement in New Mexico and elsewhere. By the way, so the data on this is the data comes from a Census Bureau report where every 5 years they survey all of the governments in the country. There's about 90,000 of them. Most of them are, of course, local, and so they take this data and then come up with county by county totals. Excuse me. And so, but because they don't want to do this in the regular census years, they're too busy. So they do this in the years ending in 2 and 7, and then they take at least 2 years to get the data published and released. So the most recent data would be for 2017, but they haven't released that yet. So unfortunately, what that means is this data is for 2012. So some of the reason I bring that up is some of the things that aren't picked up here is of course, a lot of areas are going for these higher local level minimum wages, and New Mexico was essentially a pioneer in that, with Albuquerque and Santa Fe having higher minimum wages for some time now. But that's in the next version that'll start to be picked up a little more in terms of all these other places going down that terrible road of putting in place policies that really essentially harm the very people you're trying to help.
Yeah, and it's not a surprise. New Mexico was a pioneer in bad public policy. Of course, with the legislature banning local right to work, we tried to make the principled argument that if you're going to ban things like right to work, labor restrictions or labor laws, that you should also ban minimum wage increases at the local level. But unfortunately, given the ideological makeup of our legislature, that was not on the agenda. That was not something they were interested in. In fact, our statewide minimum wage is likely to increase. The likely number is $11 an hour, which for a low-income, impoverished state like New Mexico, that's a pretty high minimum wage. Original push was for $12 with it indexed to inflation every year moving forward. We dodged that bullet, but it's still going up. And so as we get towards wrapping up here, if you're say at a random state think tank in anywhere USA, not mentioning any names, but most of us, as we do, live in metro areas, and metro areas, those communities, economically free or not, are fastest growing areas in our country. Of course, the more economically free ones tend to be much faster growing, but people by and large throughout our country are moving to these metro areas. What would you say as a part of this report? What could you deliver to a county or city councilor? You could talk to a county commissioner as well, or a mayor, whoever it might be, and say, hey, this report puts us in a really bad light. We need to change X, Y, and Z. So what are X, Y, and Z as you see it in this report?
Sure. So one piece of evidence to point to is every year when when the year comes to an end, the moving services, like for example, North American Moving Services is the one that I found data from most recently. They put out their data from the previous year, all the different moves that were made, where their trucks were going essentially. And one of the things they found for last year, and I think it was pretty similar the year before, is that California and New York were losing residents and had some of the highest rates of their outbound moves. And Texas and Florida were among the states with the highest rates of inbound moves. And so using that as motivation, one of the things I did in the report is I looked, as you mentioned earlier when we talked about the map, we break them into 4 groups: most free, second most free, et cetera. And so I took some economic data on the different groups. So just to briefly, for the most free quartile of states, you had population growth of about 5% in the most recent 4 years, whereas it was only about 1.2% in the least free quartile. So they grew about 4 times faster in terms of population. But income levels were also substantially different. So in the most free MSAs, it was about 6% above average, and in the least free, it was about 5% below. So if you think about that, that's basically equivalent to taking an 11% pay cut if you live in the least free areas compared to the most free areas, and also that the slower population growth in those low freedom areas creates kind of a more stagnant economy. You've got fewer economic opportunities, and so the thing that these guys really would benefit from, in terms of if you're looking at, as you said, county commissioners in a struggling local economy, we'll take a look at what's working in areas that are seeing all those moving trucks come in, and it's pretty clear that areas that have slower spending growth, low or even better, no income taxes, fewer labor market interventions means avoiding all those minimum wage increases that people are so excited about. That's really the recipe for getting those moving trucks moving back in the right direction and stemming the bleeding of all the population exodus that a lot of these high tax areas are experiencing.
No doubt about it. Did you, by any chance, before we let you go, did you have any, did you do any research about state level policies vis-a-vis preemption of public policies? Because, we talked about, of course, New Mexico here and the right to work versus the minimum wage dichotomy. And I know that the state of Virginia, Virginia is a pretty darn free place. It's not automatically associated with the kind of levels of economic freedom of a Texas or a Florida. But I know living in Virginia, the county and city local governments in the state of Virginia can't go to the bathroom without asking Richmond for permission to go. And I'm being somewhat facetious, but they have a very strict limit on what local governments can do. And I know Texas, we talked about Austin again. Austin, as I see it, does very well. They're a blue area in your report. And Austin, we know, is philosophically, the population leans far to the left, but repeatedly, I can specifically mention Uber and Lyft and ride sharing. There was a ban that went up for a while in Austin, and that was slapped down by the legislature. And it's kind of this back and forth situation. Did you do any correlation or causation research with regard to how strict state policies are? Because states tend to be a little more sane than a metro area by and large.
Yeah, I didn't exactly, and it would be hard to come up with a good measure of that. But you cited some important examples. I think another one that Austin here in Texas was trying to do was a what do you call it, a plastic bag ban or something along those lines. I'm kind of I've got mixed feelings on this in the sense that as kind of a federalist and someone who wants government closest to the people, I'm really inclined to say, well, let Austin, screw up their economy if they want to. Let, I guess, in your case, Santa Fe or Albuquerque or whatever example you insert locally, let them put in place bad policies, because I believe that people are smart enough to figure out what government's doing and to vote with their feet in favor of the policies they want. So some of these kind of efforts to centralize policy at the state level by preventing Austin from doing bad things, or by preventing cities in New Mexico from doing bad things, I'm not really enthusiastic about them. I mean, I think in the big picture, they probably are, helping to keep the level of economic freedom higher than it would be otherwise. But I'm concerned we're going down a slippery slope where we're taking power out of the hands of the people that are closest to the voters.
Well, on that philosophical disagreement between the two of us, we'll have to conclude things here. Dean, thanks for coming on. And again, folks, you can find this report. It's not easy, but necessary. It is at reason.org, and you can find the ranking U.S. metropolitan areas on the Economic Freedom Index by Dean, Deanstansel, and it was published on January 31st, 2019. So it's not brand new, but it's as new as you can get on this area. So thanks for your time, Dean, and we'll talk to you again, perhaps when the statewide Economic Freedom Index comes out, if not before then.
Sounds great, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's discussion. We're working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to RioGrandeFoundation.org for more information or to support our work.